Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Automotive Work Group meeting for the first half of 2023. It has been a while since we had a meeting, and naturally, a lot has been going on. Now, the chair of this work group, Endo-san, will do the introduction formally in a moment. But before he does, I'm just going to show our antitrust policy notice. We show this at the beginning of every meeting. You can find the full Linux Foundation antitrust policy on our website. And if you're from a Linux Foundation member company, you can ask any questions of our counsel, Andy Up to Grove. Because we have such a full schedule today, I will not have an elaborate start to the meeting. I will just open with our agenda and then hand over to Endo-san. I will be emceeing the meeting, so I will be back to introduce our speakers as we go. But as a brief overview, we have our introduction by the chair of this work group, Endo-san of Toyota. Then we're going to have a presentation from Russ Ealing at OSS Consultants about how to manage and the complexities of managing open source in automotive. We're going to have a retrospective from Chris Wood over at Lockheed Martin about his lessons learned in industry. We're going to get very practical with a presentation by Mary Wang, director of the open source ecosystem at Volvo Cars, about their OSPO. And we end with our good friends from Hyundai Motor Group talking about their approach to open source license compliance, and that song How Back. It's going to be a wonderful meeting, I think, live and of course recorded as always. I'll be here in the background. You have access to the chat if you have any questions, and naturally, we will welcome Q&A sessions as we go as well. This is a community event, not a formal cold event. Don't hesitate to share your thoughts, opinions, and to ask your colleagues and your friends to share knowledge. Endo-san, over to you.
Okay, thank you. Please, just a moment. Okay. Can you see my slide?
Yes, it is showing perfectly. Thank you, Endo-san.
Okay, good morning, hello, good evening. I am Masato Endo from Toyota Motor Corporation. In Japan, already 10 p.m., but I'm very exciting to hear the for great presentation from automotive and open source industry. And please give me 2 minutes to introduce our work group. Shen-san already mentioned to the antitrust policy, so I skipped it. And from 3-4 years before, I and Shen-san thinking this type of issues in the automotive industry. In automotive industry is a very huge industry, and there are many suppliers, company, and OEMs. And there are many issues of the open source license and security and quality issues inside our industry. And almost all issues is very common issues, not only one OEM supply chain, but also global, each supply chain has same issues. I and Shen-san decided to make these work groups to raise awareness about the importance of the open source itself and open source compliance in our industry, and share information about the best practice in automotive industry. And if it is possible, we'd like to discuss about the build a future industry standard of the open source supply chain management. Already, there are many companies, people included our community from the many OEMs and the suppliers and the IT companies. So we can discuss and we can share the best practice from the all over the world, like today's work group meeting. And we have the meeting. 10 or 12 meeting from already, but recently almost all meeting is this type of web meeting. But I think COVID era is already all finished. So if it's possible, I'd like to have the real meeting in this year. Shen-san, let's talk about the plan of the real meeting of the our committee also. And recently, there are many big news about the OpenChain because Cariado, software company from of the Volkswagen Group, joined OpenChain governing board. So this is very great news from as a very big news from my viewpoint. Because we can discuss about the company standard with Volkswagen and the career people well. So I'm looking forward to work with them. Okay, this is a briefly introduction of our group, and today's agenda is already Shen-san introduced that. So let's start from the last one. Already, Rasa, can you introduce your presentation?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Endo-san.
Yes.
Nice to see everybody.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah. Can I share my screen?
Yes, of course.
All right. Thank you. All right. And just confirming you can see the slide. Okay.
Yep.
Perfect.
You're not seeing two slides up there, just the one?
Just one.
All right, perfect. Hi, everyone. My name's Russ. I'm the founder of OSS Consultants. We're a business dedicated to helping organizations of all sizes manage their use of open source software. So we help organizations with everything from scanning and audit services to building an entire open source program. We're an official OpenChain partner, so we offer services for both OpenChain ISO 5230 for compliance, as well as the security assurance specification conformance. Before starting the company, I spent over 20 years in several engineering roles at General Motors. I had responsibility at that time for designing and implementing a successful global open source governance program at GM, which at the time, back in 2013, was among the first of its kind. Was once regarded as among the most comprehensive open source programs in the auto industry. As the open source compliance officer, I built the OSPO that was responsible for reviewing software in every part used in every GM vehicle across the globe. So today, myself and the rest of the team at OSS Consultants, we offer our recognized industry-leading expertise to help companies of all sizes scan, audit, and report on their software, as well as helping them to create some of the most efficient and comprehensive open source program offices. So we'll talk a little bit, just an overview of some of the high-level open source challenges in the auto industry. Given our audience today, the material on these slides here, I'm going to assume that everyone has some familiarity with the basics of open source software, or OSS for short. So with the known complexities that we have in the auto supply chain, we know there's a number of challenges that are faced on a fairly regular basis. So the use of software in the vehicle has increased exponentially, as has the use of open source software in the vehicle. So there's still a gap in the supply chain and across the auto industry in general regarding awareness and education around use of open source, though there has been considerable improvements, especially over the last 18 to 24 months with the SBOM initiatives that have taken place. So it's not uncommon for one automaker to have a supply chain that spans 18,000 global businesses or more. Those global businesses then do businesses with other automakers, other automotive suppliers, and often with other non-automotive customers. So how can the automotive industry achieve compliance and awareness around use of open source without adding more burdens to suppliers that are already in this intricate supply chain? So I had an interesting, perhaps single view of this when I was at GM, and my thought was, if we were going to lead in this space and drive open source compliance into the supply chain, it was important to get everyone in our supply chain on board. So how better to do that, at least at that time, than to make it a requirement to disclose use of open source when providing software to GM. So now, as a consultant that not only helps automotive, but also non-automotive, I have a different view, or perhaps multiple views is the better term. If each automaker had their own set of requirements for open source, imagine what that variation does to a supplier in the supply chain that does business with multiple automakers or with other device manufacturers. Think of how many possible open source bill of material formats or SBOM, software bill of material formats, or other compliance formats that you'd need to follow. So purely from my observations, it gets increasingly more difficult the further down the supply chain you go. As you have different variants of these requirements from each of your customers. So you're adding additional or more complexity to an already complex scenario. So this is an area that OpenChain can help to bring some consistencies to the approach, and can also help with reducing complexities in this space. But generally, it requires broad adoption by industry for it to be effective. So if you're new to OpenChain or just joining as a first-time attendee to this session, I'd encourage you to have a look at the resources, the OpenChain resources. You can always reach out to me to help for any help. I'm happy to help clarify anything or to be of any assistance along your open source journey. So this is a typical, very high level and very oversimplified model of a hypothetical supply chain for a single ECU. And ECU in this case stands for electronic control unit. These are the embedded devices that are responsible for most functions in a vehicle, such as controlling your engine or transmission, your heating and cooling, navigation, infotainment, instrument clusters, anti-lock braking, etc. So that single ECU may be used across a particular model line, but not necessarily be used in a different model line. So for example, vehicle A might have model variants 1, 2, and 3. Some or all of those models could then use that one ECU, but vehicle B, which may have its own variants, may not use that same ECU that was used in vehicle A. So you can imagine the complexity with that level of permutations across a vehicle portfolio. So most automakers usually don't directly deal with the vendors beyond the tier 1. But typically the tier 3 would provide a small piece of hardware or low-level software. The tier 2 supplier might provide a component like a processor or sometimes an operating system or an application. And then the tier 1 typically provides a finished ECU to the OEM. The OEM then uses that ECU in a vehicle and then performs the vehicle assembly and, of course, the ultimate sale to the customer. So the average vehicle has generally greater than 30 ECUs, and then depending on content, the combination of ECUs could also be different. So we have a number of challenges. How do we know if everyone in the supply chain has declared all open source used or all of their included dependencies? Perhaps declaring top level or package level or direct dependencies, the licenses for those, maybe that's sufficient at some companies. Some software companies still declare they aren't using any open source, but then their story generally changes once we're able to scan their software for use of open source and discover, to everyone's surprise, that they are in fact using plenty of open source, just like the rest of the modern world. Here's another challenge. It's not common, or at least it wasn't common, to get source code from suppliers in the auto industry. So there's generally not a robust way to verify, at least at a granular level, what's actually being provided beyond asking for the information in your own proprietary format, of course. Just kidding. According to a 2020 report that I saw, a developer has had access to almost 22,000 new open source component releases per day since the beginning of 2018. So it's easy to see that the pace of software development has surpassed our capacity for being able to manually identify licensing and security concerns at a granular level, or a level that's granular enough to mitigate the risk. Again, that report was from 3 years ago, and I suspect that number has grown significantly beyond the 22,000 today. Actually, there was a report from OSI earlier this year that said 80% of survey respondents had an increase or significant increase in their use of open source in their applications. And less than 20% of survey respondents said their use of open source stayed the same or decreased. So while it seems conceivable that everyone in a distributed supply chain could, or at least should, be able to provide open source usage information, rarely, if ever, does it ever come out as clean as this to the automaker. So, I mean, ideally, you would have the open source usage report from the supply chain, as well as the open source usage from the OEM that makes up that one single comprehensive bill of materials for a particular device or ECU. Is there anyone here from the automotive industry in here that has been able to comprehensively achieve this yet? And we can chat about that after if you'd like. So historically, a comprehensive open source bill of materials would have been extremely rare. I'd say it's better today, especially due to the recent SBOM efforts over the last couple of years. But I think we still have a long way to go around awareness and adoption of open source best practices, such as those identified in OpenChain. Another point on this slide before I move on, if everyone agrees that an open source bill of materials or software bill of materials for this single automotive ECU might be challenging, how about an open source bill of materials or software bill of materials for an entire vehicle? So I think we've got some work to do. Another challenge is your own internal engineering and development centers around the globe that use different software development lifecycle processes and tools, depending on what kind of software they're using. So an infotainment and navigation system requires a significantly different development process and configuration management than, say, an engine controller does. To have an efficient process for managing open source means the OSPO or other governance structure has to have a consistent policy for managing that use, regardless of how or where that software is developed. Another important distinction in this diagram, it's not just the difference in the types of devices, but how they're connected. So open source is likely used in all of these devices to some degree. Device A has a display, so it could use that potentially for displaying any required license compliance material. It's also on the same communication bus as device B and device C. Device D doesn't have its own display, and it's not directly connected to a display in the vehicle. In fact, it's on a completely separate communication bus, maybe like a LIN bus, and it comes from a completely different supplier and plays an entirely different function in the vehicle. So where should device D have its required license material, that's compliance material? Some people might say it belongs in the owner's manual. Others might say it should be hard-coded into the main vehicle display. But then how would those locations be updated if device D gets a service replacement with a change in software, or has its software updated by an over-the-air update? Obviously, we can't get too deep into this today, but the good news is that it can be managed with the right approach, the right tools and processes in place. Again, feel free to reach out if you want to discuss this point further. So what can we learn from the complexity of managing open source in a distributed supply chain like the automotive supply chain? So as a global organization, it was important for me to have a simplified open source governance structure and process that could be applied to any of GM's global engineering development centers. Sometimes this structure or team is referred to as the OSPO or Open Source Program Office. I spoke of inventory relative to an open source bill of materials, and we don't have time to cover it here, but equally important is the inventory of all of your open source usage, but especially in your distributed products. So absolutely, it takes effort and time to set up, but it's worth it if you consider the potential consequences. I really like to take this back to basics a bit, because the thought of meeting some of the recent SBOM requirements is daunting for a lot of people. But inventory is critical regardless of your focus, whether that's SBOM or software bill of materials, open source compliance, or the security of open source software. If you've heard any of my other talks before, you can't comply, secure, or remediate any software you don't know is there. I say that in almost every talk I give. So don't not do SBOM or software bill of materials because it's big. You have to start with the basics if you need to. And by all means, please reach out if you'd like to chat about this further, or you need help getting started. But it's important that everyone starts somewhere, because inventory of your open source can yield large dividends. This is where the inventory and tracking practices in the automotive industry apply really well. So every car built has a listing of every part required to build that car. This helps automakers to quickly track and then address any quality issues. If and when a part happens to be faulty, they're able to quickly determine which cars were affected, and then prioritize any subsequent actions that might be needed, such as recalls or service bulletins. The same is true or should be true for software. Similar to automotive parts, with an inventory, a company can track every open source component they use and have better ability to resolve any issues if and when they arise. In the case of security, which we didn't touch on too much here, knowing the exact version of each component is critical. And an accuracy of an open source bill of materials allows your organization to quickly assess these risks and potentially reduce or eliminate any unnecessary rework. Collaboration is really important, both inside and inside your organization and outside. I often talk with others in the software or open source space to understand their best practices as well as any pain points. And I also try to share some of my experience with what works and sometimes what may not have worked so well. But honestly, I'm a big fan of people just asking if they have a question. You know, anyone can reach out anytime if you've got a question. I'm happy to share experiences, best practices. You know, I'm a consultant in this space, so myself and the team, we see a really broad range of what works in industry and what doesn't work from organizations of all sizes all around the world. So I promise you're not bothering me, and I'm more than happy to help. Reach out by email or feel free to find me on LinkedIn, which should be pretty easy as well. So some of the keys to managing open source risk, when you have an implemented compliance program or OSPO in your organization, you get better understanding and traction within your organization. Inventory of your open source is, excuse me, critical. You need to know what you're using and how you've complied. This can also help with assessing your risk, as we discussed earlier, but it'll also help you to formulate any longer-term strategies for risk mitigation. So you want to require your third-party suppliers and OEMs to disclose their use of open source to you. You don't know what your risk is until you know what you've used in your product. As I said earlier, you can't remediate or fix what you don't know is there. Discovering issues earlier in the development cycle means or can mean less impact on development times and meeting business deadlines. You can think of finding licensing issues or security issues to finding a bug in a software application. The earlier it's discovered, the less expensive and the less of an impact it is to correct. And then, as you'll see in the OpenChain reference material, the basics of open source compliance and management of open source should be taught at all levels in the organization. Continuing on with some additional keys to managing risk. So from a strategy perspective, to be successful and efficient, you need a strategy for execution, and perhaps most importantly, someone to lead that effort. You should have a vision and defined goals that cover what you want open source usage and compliance to look like in your organization. Some considerations here are lining up your vision and goals with the strategy of the organization itself. What's the best or most efficient model for managing compliance at your organization? It might be a distributed team. It could be functional responsibility. It could be a centralized approach. There isn't always necessarily a one-size-fits-all or cookie-cutter approach to this. Team structure and other resourcing to support that model might be another consideration. Policy should be designed with the company's culture and the strategy in mind. The policy should be a statement of your expectations regarding use of open source, and that should be communicated or at least available to most parts of the organization that might be involved with software development. Having a well-defined policy in place is certainly important, but it's got to be a well-defined minimal policy. Otherwise, you'll have lawyers, security folks, business folks, all piling in their concerns and constraints, and then soon you'll end up with a straitjacket full of policy that basically means nobody can do anything. Another common, but in my opinion, sometimes ineffective form of open source policy is the concept of a whitelist or a blacklist. Licensing in open source is very contextual. So the scenario that surrounds each use case matters because it can change the risk profile. The other reason this type of list doesn't work well most often is that brand new licenses are added to software projects potentially every single day. So it'd be impossible to maintain which licenses are allowed and which ones are not allowed. The last thing I'll say about this kind of list is that most software developers, while they're developing, are not going to look at it every time they want to potentially use a piece of software, which is why the process is so important. So with process, we want to develop we've talked about the formal open source strategy and the policy, and now we're talking about process here. So you want to empower your organization to balance the business benefits with the right amount of risk management. So without a good process for use of open source, you don't have any rules or control over what's actually getting used, and then what to do when it doesn't align with what your organization allows. I find too often managing use of open source is spread across several people, and perhaps each of them responsible for a particular functional area, such as legal or security. The problem with this is that it lacks ownership and accountability. Further, I think most processes aren't defined in a single place, and they require developers to just know how things are supposed to work. It's a broad assumption. So the processes that we help create, they're very efficient, and they're designed to meet the goals of the business. So not just legal, not just security, but most importantly, developers and engineering staff. So the process for whatever you're putting together can be designed for an entire dedicated team, or even a team of one. So it's important to still be creative while being effective. For developer training, here again, the focus should be on efficiency and key developer takeaways. I've seen and heard of open source training sessions that take several hours to several days. These generally aren't as productive, or they don't yield much practical fruit. We can't, or at least shouldn't, expect to turn a developer into an open source license expert. I generally want to make it easy for a developer to do the right thing and difficult to do the wrong thing. So the developer training sessions that we do are generally under an hour, but they highlight only the 3 or 4 things that I want them to do really well, and then let the process manage the rest. Creating an OSPO or other type of governance structure, this would be the designated place that acts as your center of competency for an organization's open source operations and their structure. So sometimes this includes setting code use, code distribution, selection of software, auditing, and potentially other policies, as well as training and ensuring legal compliance, and then promoting and building community engagement, which can also help benefit the organization strategically. There's a growing number of companies adopting open source program offices to be their centers of competency. There was a GitHub survey from earlier this year that showed over 30% of Fortune 100 companies have now implemented an OSPO to help structure their organizational policies and procedures around use of open source. And GitHub, the folks that put out that report, like us, they expect the number to increase going forward. So an OSPO doesn't need to be a massive investment from a resource perspective. You could certainly have an OSPO of 1 if that works for your organization. An OSPO of 1 might also be just a great starting point for you. So some of the benefits of having an open source governance program. When you have an open source governance program like an OSPO, you get better understanding of use of open source within the company, better confidence in your open source compliance posture. Your formal processes will help your developers to make informed decisions about the risks surrounding use of open source. And as a result, the company's exposure to the risks around open source usage would be significantly reduced. In addition to all of these implementing an open source governance program directly helps you just become a better software company. And every company's at a different stage of maturity with this. But some specific actions could be to get support from your leadership on making this more important, or how to make this more important to them. How do you make it more robust? You might want to engage your legal staff to help build your case for why this is important. See what you can do from an automation perspective. Leverage the policy management features of your scanning tools if you happen to use those. And I think I better stop there. That's all the slides I have. I want to leave enough time for all the other presenters, but as I mentioned throughout the slides, please feel free to reach out if you have any questions on any of the topics that we discussed here. Always happy to help, but especially if you happen to be stuck on how to get started with any of this. Shane, are we over to Chris now?
Yep, we're going to bring Chris in. Before I do that, I'm just going to launch a little bit of a poll for us. So this poll is just an informal poll to get some feedback on what's happening for you in your company. Now, the poll will be anonymous, so don't worry, we're not going to pin anything on a particular company's strategy. The idea is just to give some options about talking about what you're doing in the industry currently. Now, for Chris, we're going to change gears a little bit. We're going to dive into a conversation with Chris before we move into two more formal presentations. As you might know, Chris is the co-chair of the OpenChain Specification Work Group. He's been involved with significantly complex industrial management for many decades. And is a fellow at Lockheed Martin, which of course gives you an insight into the type of complexity he's used to. And Chris, if it's okay, I wanted to spend perhaps 10 minutes with just a few notes going back and forth about your experience in managing the type of complexity that significant industry has. Perhaps, correct me if I'm wrong, but you were one of the first people I think, visible in a company like Lockheed Martin, working on open source policy, engaging outside in the community. And I just wanted to pose the first question, which is the obvious one. When it comes to an organization like that, with incredibly refined and complex processes, how does the change management into open source work? How heavy a lift was it? Or was it something that almost came organically because of the expertise in process management?
Well, I think there's two sides to that. One is from a processor configuration management, software configuration management standpoint, it was relatively easy because we already had established software configuration management policies. So what we did is we established a parallel and very similar change management process for tracking what's happening in the open source world for the open source software specifically. We've been doing this for, I don't know, I was drug into the fray in the very early 2000s, and I was asked to help set up turn this light off. There we go. I was asked to set up a process initially to consider the use of open source software, because up until that point in time, we were adamant that we were not going to use open source software within the company. So we looked at it and we started developing a tool, because there weren't any, to scan open source software at the source code level in order to identify all of the necessary attributions of software from a copyright and licensing standpoint, and then discern what those licenses were, and then work with legal to determine whether or not those licenses were in fact useful. And I think that as that has evolved over the years, I've been more and more of a technical consultant to legal, to, as Russ was describing, work with them to understand how that license is used in context with the software, how it's applied to the software, whether it's something that the author just chooses, or whether it's something that the tool, for example, in the case of the GCC, actually has licenses that have been chosen by the GNU Foundation to license their open source software with. And so a lot of times in the beginning, we were just yes or no on licenses, and we found out that that really doesn't work because there are applications where the license itself and its requirements don't actually affect what you want to do with the software itself. So it became conditional.
I have a sort of, I suppose, a follow-up question to this, which is that it's, I think, pretty well known that in the defense industry, things like a bill of materials, a comprehensive bill of materials, every piece of hardware, every piece of software has been, in one way or another, existing for a long time. Now, in open source, talking about software bill of materials has trended very recently. SPDX is about 10 years old, 12 now. And the dialogue for software bill of materials pushed forward by the executive order and so on is less than 24 months old. In this sense, was something like the defense industrial market space ahead of the game with comprehensive bill of materials? Or is there also something for companies like Lockheed to learn from what we're seeing coming out of open source, things like SPDX or Cyclone and so on?
Well, that's kind of a funny question because as part of the tool that I helped to lead the development of back 20 years ago, we incorporated the ability to, from a software licensing perspective, create a software bill of material complete by component, by version, for each delivery that we made of the software, both internally and externally. And those software bill of materials, as we call them, because the context for software bill of materials has changed a lot since the federal government has issued its edicts. And for a while, software bill of materials only applied to software vulnerability. And that's absolutely not true. You've got to have the whole picture. And in fact, SPDX and Cyclone DX have to some extent different between the two, but they both have the capability of reporting both. So then it goes back to the question, are you doing your software scanning at the lowest level? In other words, at the source code level, because that's the only level at which most scanners can pick up all of the licensing and all of the attribution requirements and things that are actually in the software to report in your SBOM. If you just are doing the binary software, for example, libraries and whatnot, you get the top level license, but you won't necessarily get all of the other licenses, and some of them may be much more risky as they're embedded in the software and you don't know that they're there. So that's why we try to do everything at the source code level.
That sort of touches on a discussion that trended a little bit late last year, but I didn't see it continuing, where people started talking about different types of SBOM. So they started talking about a binary SBOM, a source SBOM, and so on. And I think when they were saying that, they were trying to articulate that depending on the stage of the software that you look at, the information is different. If you look at the source, it's different to what you get when you look at the binary. And rather than needing a bunch of SBOMs, I think what people were really trying to articulate was that there may be an inflection point like source where we probably should start building our SBOM, because otherwise we might get a much lesser picture. And if we do create, let's say, a binary SBOM, we would need to have a source SBOM to compare and contrast and make sure we've covered our bases. So it's a very useful insight, Chris.
Yeah, and I think that it's an important insight that people need to kind of realize, because the owners or the people who own the repository that's building up an application, for example, and we'll just use GitHub. SourceForge is not quite so popular these days. They assign in a lot of cases, an easy license like an MIT license or a BSD license that doesn't matter what version of BSD it is, or something like that, or an Apache license. When in fact, if you actually look at the source code that's inside there, you may find GNU Affero licenses, you may find the Creative Commons no commercial use license. There are just a variety of licenses that are actually in that software that you don't see, because the owner has put an MIT license at the top level, and you go, oh yeah, I can use that. That library is licensed under an MIT license, until you go download the source code, and then you go, holy mackerel, it says non-commercial use. And what does that mean? That means if you're a commercial company, and depending on the policies that your legal has set up within your OSPO, non-commercial use may restrict you from using it internally and externally.
Now, to wrap up with one final question, it's been extraordinary to have such a cross section of different industries engaging. So, for instance, Chris, when you turned up and especially helped us build the security standard, coming in with your optics, fully understanding that we needed to be super simple, but also understanding that we needed to have some clear points in a specification to be useful. And meanwhile, we have people from completely different industries, like cloud or consumer electronics, providing their input. This sharing recently seems to have been very beneficial, and perhaps it's presumptuous of me to say so, but I hope it has been inspirational in, let's say, traditional process-heavy industries like defense or automotive, in providing people with some slightly new ways to look at things, or maybe to problem solve, as well as the other direction, which is, mature industries saying to newer industries, by the way, you need to have some structure.
Yes, and we've been saying that for quite a number of years with both the OEMs and our third-party software providers, both from the commercial applications that we use internally to develop our products, as well as the software that we receive from industry, and let's just say Visual Studio development environment from Microsoft or Green Hills software, where you have redistributable components that are within those tools that you use internally to develop your software, but those become part of your software. So whenever you're obtaining tools from vendors, you really need to ask them to provide you with at least a list of all of the components and licenses in their software and the vulnerabilities associated with those. And it's been surprising at how many of the vendors don't even know what you're talking about. So we've been educating vendors now for about 15 years through our procurement department, who I work also closely with on this issue. And I think that one of the things that is starting to become more prevalent across general industry is actually putting something into your procurement requests that require them to provide you with that insight, since they don't want to seem to do it on their own.
Fantastic. Thank you for giving us a little bit of an insight into your experience from defense industry. And while automotive is in a slightly different zone, I think they have many of the same concerns. And the fact that you've been plowing away at open source for 20 years, I think means that the conclusions you've come to can be of immediate benefit to companies in automotive who might only just be setting up an OSPO today, in the last year or two, and beginning to pull together their more formalized process. So thank you so much, Chris. That's much appreciated.
Oh, you're welcome. Yeah, we, from an inventory standpoint, as Russ mentioned in his talk, it is absolutely imperative that you maintain a end-to-end complete version history of all of the open source software that you use. I don't know how many hundreds and hundreds of thousands of files that we have stored in a offline database of all of the source code that we actually scanned as we brought that software into the company, so that we've got it to refer back to for continual scanning to see if that particular version of a component actually has a vulnerability that's popped up in the world. And then you can go back and you can start seeing which of your products you need to remediate or notify your customers of. So that's my last thought.
It's a good thought. And Chris, we mentioned this on a call a few months ago, I guess. It's interesting how software that you thought was for a while turns out to be around for 40 years. So having an inventory is more important than it might seem on the surface, an inventory for absolutely everything if possible.
Absolutely.
Right. So we're going to pull back from the strategic experience view that Chris has given us and go into a practical presentation where we're going to have Mary from Volvo talk about specifically how did Volvo go around making their OSPO? What did they do? Now, while Mary's getting ready to share her slides, just to let you know, the poll is still open. 13 of 28 people have gone through it. More would be welcome. That data will be a bit of fun for us to get an idea of what's going on in your companies at the moment. And Mary, before you start your presentation, you've been on a bit of a tour of China recently. Now, Volvo is owned by Geely Group, but not just that, you've been talking at government events and so on and so forth. And one question that came up in our chat was a question about OSPOs in China Automotive. And the question was, does BYD have an OSPO? So my question to you is, have you bumped into OSPOs in automotive in China at, say, BYD or SAIC or other parts of Geely Group? We have no audio from you at the moment, Mary.
Hello, can you hear me?
Oh, now we can hear you.
Okay.
Yes. So there was just that question about, on your China tour, have you bumped into other OSPOs from Chinese automakers?
Yes. During my China tour, I have met many open source people, not only for automotive industry, but also for many high-tech companies in China. For example, we have met like open source people from Xiaomi and from BYD and Zeekr, etc. So I have a automotive open source group, WeChat group also. So I have built a lot of contacts here.
It looks like we need to build more bridges with China to get experience from these companies because there is an awareness that, for instance, the Chinese EV makers have been very software heavy for a long time. So it's possible there's some very sophisticated software management going on that we haven't yet engaged with. But let's engage with Europe. Mary, tell us what you're doing at Volvo. Show us what you're doing. Over to you.
Okay, thank you. Seems I cannot open my video, so you'll stop it or?
Yeah, if you share your slides, that's fine.
Yes, I mean my video also.
I haven't touched your video.
It works before, but now I can't do it. Anyway, I will share my slide. Can you see the screen now?
It is just starting. Yes, we can see it.
Okay, cool.
Thank you, Mary.
Hello, everyone. My name is Mary Wang. I'm Director of Open Source Ecosystem for Volvo Cars. I can introduce myself first. Before I take the Director of Open Source Ecosystem, I worked as a SME, subject matter expert for CM areas, configuration management. Chris Wood just mentioned that it's easier for CM people to take this open source area because it's quite tight connected. So I have been working in Volvo Cars for 5 years and basically 3.5 years for the CM area and 1.5 years for the open source area. So basically I created the OSPO for Volvo Cars. Before that, I have spent 9 years in Ericsson AB in Sweden also. I was a DevOps engineer who is building this continuous integration portal for our products, and also take the technical product manager for one of our products. So this is basically what I did in the past. Oh, is this a mistake? Okay, a fake Swedish person who likes play badminton, that's me. So I have lived in Sweden for about 13 years now. This is one of my hobby, so I like it a lot. Okay, today I'm going to share with you a little bit short introduction of Volvo Cars and our OSPO journey. Also, I will share with you about what is the compliance challenges generally and also in Volvo Cars, based on what we have done so far and what we have learned so far. So this is today's sharing content. So what does Volvo mean? Do you know that Volvo actually have another specific meaning here? Usually I said if you answer it correctly, you will get a free Volvo EX90. Of course, it's a model. Okay, it's a Latin word. It means I roll here. So this is our history from 1915. In fact, Volvo at that time was a subsidiary company of SKF. So it's just registered the Volvo brand. But the Volvo company was registered or founded in 1927 until today. You can see probably there was no open source in the 1927, the first Volvo car at that time. So during this period, Volvo's fat, let's say, is up and down also. It was sold to Ford from 1999 after 10 years, and it was bought by Geely Group till today. So today, the current profit is quite well. This is the global site for Volvo Cars, and the head of office is still in Sweden, Gothenburg. It's a city where I lived. And now I'm in the business field in China, Shanghai also. So the office in Shanghai is quite nice. It's very big R&D center here. So based on this global site and the many countries have the R&D site also with the plant also. So it's become bigger and bigger now. This is our new e-car here, EX90, XC40, and C40 also. We have one more, in fact, which I didn't put the picture here. Is probably you already know that it's a EX30. It's the smallest SUV in Volvo Cars. Like many other automotive companies, we are doing the software transformation also, including the continuous integration and the new platform, new product architecture, etc. We still focus on the safety, the sustainability, and new technology also. Of course, we used a lot of open source in our product because, you know, today you probably cannot survive without using the open source in your product. So that's why we need or must work on the open source area. So this is our Osborne journey. As I mentioned, I started this area from 2022 as a part-time job or hobby project. We have worked on the basic fundamental stuff together with many open source volunteers in the company and doing the work. So we formed the Osborne from bottom to up. In 2023, the January of 2023, we got the official assignment for Osborne for Volvo Cars. So we have hired some people from, let's say, the Sony Mobile, from the, and also we get one headcount from the legal department also. So we have Carl from, who is the open source strategist also. And Zora in our team. So we have 4 people today. So our target is continue to drive the open source maturity level for Volvo Cars. And the driving factor it's similar to all other companies because it takes a long lead time for the engineer to get the approval for open source requests. And we really don't have the process for open source consumption, distribution, and contribution. So we started to working on this area. So what we did internally for the compliance. So we created all of this policy, process, training material, and we do the training course for all the site. It's ongoing nowadays. It's not finished yet. And we train them in the detail level, like we create the end-to-end process to ask for several projects to try out, to continuously improve the process. And we define the roles and the responsibilities for the 3R's work. For example, we have assigned the open source champions for each small line of business. And we put the requirement for delivering the compliance artifacts on software release team as a key gatekeeper. And the most important thing is working on the pilot project closely with the development team to try out the end-to-end process, which is a very good approach to make your process more efficient so people will use it. If it's let's say too much admin work, then it's difficult to implement in reality. This is one of our pilot projects. It's the IHU, the ECU in the infotainment system. You can see in the screen, you can get all of this legal information, including all of the open source component information. So it's the same in the system setting. It's the same as like Apple, you have this, all of the information in your system setting in your phone. This is our internal main open source site. From this site, people can find everything regarding the open source areas, including the roles and responsibilities, and the rules and regulations, training, and the process for open source consumption and the contribution, and all the black-white list for the licenses. We have a dashboard called OSS Maturity also to show that which department have managed the open source compliance in a better way or not. What we did externally, so far we have released 7 open source projects, which is published in our Volvo Cars GitHub. We also started to promoting this to our suppliers. We built up all of the process when the people interact with our suppliers. So there will be open source checklists when you receive the software from the suppliers. We create the email box so people can contact us both internally and externally. So we plan to do a lot of more in the future, and including the deep engagement, for example, with projects which provide the business value for Volvo Cars. Also, we positively communicated with the external community. For example, in my China tour, I have attended the GOAT GOTC conference and some conference with OpenChain governance meetings. And also we have joined the Auspology event in Stockholm last year also. It's very good for the new OSPON to learn this area and to communicate with the people and share the same pain points and learn from each other. This is what we did. One of the interesting things, we work together tightly with our peers. For example, this is one of the open source from the contribution list. You can see we have worked with BMW and Volkswagen also for the same project. So all of us contributed to this project. Is a common usage for all of us. This is our external development portal for open source. And you can see the right picture is about our GitHub repos. So in our external development portal website, we put all of our open source contribution project there. We also plan to put all of our open source compliance artifacts there in the future. Now I'm going to talk about the compliance challenges for open source usage. We divide these challenges to 3 big parts. Of course, you have more challenges than this, but this is the main challenges as we see here. Breadth challenges, automation challenges, and scope challenges. The first one, breadth challenges. I think this is the same challenge for all big company. So roll out this policy training process in a big international company is not easy. You need to kind of spread this information all over the world. And compliance challenges from suppliers with different levels of compliance maturity is a challenge also. In fact, it's the same as internal company. Different departments also have different levels of compliance maturity. So implementation, these changes in each development team is also difficult. Even though you have OSPON, you have the policy strategy process, but the implementation work is really a big challenge. Without the implementation, you have nothing. The second part is about automation challenges. So at the beginning, you need to do a make, buy, share analysis. Once you decide to use the open source, you will do this evaluation, review, and approve. Integrate to CI, scanning, get this notice file or SBOM or secure vulnerability report. You triage the scanning report. You analyze it. You integrate this to your continuous deployment system. So all of this, the automation is very important here. Work tightly with your CI team, CD team, and release team to make all of this end-to-end process as much as possible to make it automated. Basically, CI and CD is quite easier for companies to do, but to automate the open source usage end-to-end process is not easy. The last part is about the scope challenges. As we know, people nowadays doing this compliance work, most of the case is they supply with more open source information than needed. There's 2 parts here. The first one is to narrow the scope from the open source list, from the source code repo to the deliverables. Because people, when they do this experiment or try out, they download the open source into their repos. But in the end, they do not compile with all of the open source into their products. When you scan the source code or your repos, you probably get more than you needed. The second part is about getting open source compliance artifacts for each individual vehicle with different car config is a challenge also. When we release a car, we don't kind of release each specific variant, we release a complete baseline, which includes many different type of the cars. So in this case, we still release a subset of the open source in this case. So based on these challenges, how Volvo Cars or how we Osborne, what we did to meet these challenges. The first one I talk about the Osborne Authority. Before we formed the Osborne team, it's really difficult to have the mandate to do all this work. So only from bottom to up seems quite challengeable. But after we formed the Osborne, it's a little bit easier to get all the high managers' attention. So for example, we can align with the high managers to assign the open source champions role, which they have their roles and responsibility. Even though the OSS champion probably is not a 100% headcount, but it can be like software developer or software architecture. They will spend like 5 to 10% of their workload to take care of this open source in their development teams. So we borrow or use the high manager's power to make the Osborne's life easier. The second part is about the open source champion. We assign the open source champion in a small scope rather than the big scope for each line of business. In fact, I learned this from the Amazon Osborne. In Amazon, they have 200 OSS champions in their company. Of course, they have much more open source projects than Volvo Cars. But still, to have the OSS champion in a small scope, like which they're responsible for, let's say, hundreds of people like this, instead of have one OSS champion for quite a big department, that's quite difficult also. The third one, which is I think is the most important thing, is make the engineer's life easier. So, for example, elaborate the concrete compliance work to dev teams. Don't just use PPT or high-level theory or ISO standard for give them that part of kind of material to them. It won't work. Even though each company have your OSS directive or OSS policy, developers probably don't look at it. So what developers need is what you need to do and how. This how is quite in the detailed level, like instruction, step 1, 2, 3, 4, what is the output, in which phase, when they need to scan, what they need to scan from the tooling, what the open source compliance artifacts they needed to store, and then stored in the central data system. And finally, the Osborne will extract all these open source compliance artifacts to the central server, let's say, or website. So always keep the automation in mind when you build this end-to-end process, because engineers hate the admin work. I can take one example here. So in a company, you probably have many different source code version management tool, and then you probably have one or more scanning tool. So how you integrate this scanning tool in their CI chain, you probably need to write a script to help each development team for this purpose. You do not need to ask each team to invent their own script for this. The second example I can give you is like, based on the scanning tool, you have generated the notice file, let's say. You have all of this open source component information, including the open source component name, version, and the license, etc. But how you filter all of this, how you filter the copyleft licensed information from the notice file. Since every team probably need to do this work, then the Osborne is good for Osborne to have a central script to help people to do so. So this will reduce a lot of the engineers' time. So this is our goal, to make the Volvo Cars to be ISO conformant soon. So what is the future will be. Okay, I hope Volvo will make the code roll across the solar system, and we publish as much as open source project there, and we contribute as much as we can. Thank you. Any questions?
Thank you so much, Mary. That was an excellent presentation. And I think you'll find that you've provided food for thought for everyone on the line. I'm not sure if we have any direct questions at the moment. People are talking about things like open source champions in the chat. They think it's an interesting concept. If questions arise, we will swing back to you. Thank you very much for making time today, because I know it's late in China. Speaking of late, it is very late in Korea. And our good friends from Hyundai are on the line to close this meeting with a presentation about Hyundai Motor Group's open source compliance. So I'd like to welcome Songha back to the stage from the IP team 2 to talk about their perspective. Over to you, Songha. Now, if there's any issue with audio or sharing your screen, I'll let you know.
Hello,
Hi,
can you hear me?
I can hear you, and your screen is sharing perfectly. We can see a very beautiful car.
Hello, everyone. I'm Songha Baek. I'm in charge of the open source group at Hyundai Motor Company. I'm here to be attending automotive working group meeting for the first time. I'm here to share Hyundai Motor Group open source compliance, focusing on managing open source with complex supply chain and ISO 5230 certification. I'll share how we have formed our internal open source compliance and how we want to go forward. Chapter 1 is our group's open source compliance. We are going to briefly look into how we have developed from beginning till today. This is the timeline how we have developed open source management. From managing open source by individual R&D groups to forming OSPO, Open Source Program Office, and gaining ISO certificate. Before 2016, when we joined OIN, Open Invention Network, open source management was carried out by individual R&D organizations. In 2018, the importance of open source management and the need for integrated management have been emerged. From then, we have formed a task force team composed of IP, legal, and R&D and started its operation and development. In 2021, the OSPO was established under the IP group to perform complete open source verification and management. By continuously developing the open source compliance programs, in 2022, we obtained ISO 5230 certification, which is the only international standard in the field of open source compliance. This is rough description of OSPO management process we have. I'll explain the overall management model, focusing on the points that are important in the automotive field. OSPO is formed in the IP group to manage and maintain the general policies of open source we use. OSPO manages and distributes the open source policies, OSS manuals, and internal R&D and suppliers use the OSS complying with these policies. The R&D groups and suppliers submit a report of OSS used in the developing vehicle and parts. Then, there is an approval procedure to find out whether open source was used in accordance with our policy. Legal counsel from legal department are often required to interpret vague OSS license terms and resolve legal disputes if occurs. At the end, when the open source compliance is finally approved, the required notice and disclosure of open source license are notified to the customers. Also, channels to receive inquiries from the customers are built and operated by license requirement. The difficulty of operating OSPO was the great volume and complexity of our supply chain. As you all know, there are more than 30,000 parts and more than 700 suppliers related to single vehicle manufacture. In this environment, we have focused on 2 points to minimize compliance issues and achieve the reliability of vehicles' open source compliance. The first point is creating a simple internal policy. As the supply chain progresses through the multi-level tiers, there are a number of SMEs with no concept of open source compliance. For these companies, complex open source policy can be excessive requirements to comply. They could prepare excluding open source usage or cause problems in the reliability of reports. Accordingly, a simple case classification and internal policy is established to prevent unwanted disclosure of our software assets. We have classified OSS source codes into 3 cases. Case number 1 is the OSS with policy only requiring original OSS code disclosure and notice. Case number 2 adds to case 1 a disclosure of codes we have modified to apply to our product. Case number 3 adds to case 2 a disclosure of codes which are linked to the original OSS or modified codes. The link here usually includes static and dynamic link and connected and integrated codes. We limited us and suppliers to use OSS within case number 2, disclosing modified codes. We find the disclosure of linked codes such as case number 3 is too much. Also, we structured the process for suppliers to record and report all the OSS used in their supply chain. So OEM like us can review and approve OSS compliance. The second point we focused on was the collaboration with the relevant government agency. Open source experts and verification tools are essential for suppliers to manage and report open source compliance. However, SMEs lack those experts and tools. To solve these problems, we have collaborated with NIPA, a government agency who could provide open source education and verification tools for free to SMEs. Now, let's look into open source ISO certification we got. In August 22nd, 2022, Hyundai Motor have acquired ISO 5230 certificate. Since lots of you here have previously obtained the certification, let me briefly explain our differentiated factors. We did not gain the ISO certificate alone. Rather, we gathered up with 4 of our group companies related to open source and prepared requirements for certificate together. We have gathered Hyundai, Kia, Autoever, and Mobis, who are software specialists and software packaging company in Hyundai Motor Group. With them, we could set an optimal process that covers the entire software life cycle. In the course of doing so, a fast, stable relationship of continuous collaboration was formed between the companies. Also, to maximize the efficiency of OSS compliance developments, we got assistance from a community Korean working group. Chapter 2 is group companies compliance expansion. As the vehicle architecture paradigm shifts to zone-based architecture, the complexity and volume of the software used in the vehicle increased dramatically. Therefore, importance of OSS compliance in the supply chain has risen continuously. Single failure of OSS compliance of one software in the supply chain can cause failure of the whole vehicle's OSS compliance. This can cause serious harm to OEM like us. To prevent this, we strive to manage the supply chain as described here. However, there is a challenge in boosting reliability of total OSS compliance, since suppliers in the supply chain has to mature their understanding of OSS compliance. In this environment, Hyundai aimed to continuously expand open source compliance to improve overall management. With these goals, the company is promoting projects to support other suppliers and group companies that lack management capabilities. And final chapter. Finally, this is our aim for development. We want to internally create a culture to collaborate with OSS ecosystem and recognizing importance of OSS. We aim to spread out the culture and management improvements with our supply chain. The final goal is to go beyond only compliance and improve and be part of OSS community. Thank you.
Wow, thank you very much. That was an incredible presentation. You know, we've had an immediate, super positive reaction from the audience. People found many parts of it very interesting, but we had one specific question. Yari noted that the NIPA looks like an interesting concept. How heavy is the training is his question. Oh, and one of your colleagues just replied, NIPA educates the basic concept of open source software and consultation on compliance with SMEs. So that sounds like it's not too heavy. It's the basics to get people started. Would that
Yes.
be? Mm-hmm.
Yes, right. Not heavy. The basic concept and OSS just concert is basic concept.
It's a really good onboarding, and it's something that Endo-san also highlighted. He said, I really respect what Hyundai has done in involving their suppliers in obtaining OpenChain certification. And he thinks that this is the industry best practice. And I have to agree. Having a large company guide this supply chain was always one of the visions and the dreams of OpenChain. So it's fantastic to see a very clear case study of Hyundai doing that. I mean, thank you so much for these slides. And you know, I hope that perhaps in the future we could have a copy of these slides to share with people, if that's okay.
Yes, if that's okay, but I want to you inform to me before that.
Of course, of course, of course. Well, what we have got right now is just this wonderful presentation you gave us. This, and thank you so much for this. I'm going to bring Endo-san in now as well as we move towards ending the meeting. Endo-san, shall we just check if there's any last questions? What do you think?
Yes, as Shen-san said, there are four very great presentations, especially I think one headache of the involving suppliers is I think each waves companies same headache. So I think with Hyundai is a has a best practice to involve suppliers and to give the to make the good open source compliance culture and structure in the supply chain. So we'd like to sharing the information. We'd like to continue that. And if it's possible, we have this meeting in summer also. And if it's possible, we'd like to have the face-to-face meeting after that. That's all. Yes.
What a great idea, Endo-san. Let's work towards some face-to-face meetings. We have some events coming up. We've got Open Source Summit Europe, and that will be in September. And then we have Open Source Summit Japan, for example, which will be in December. So maybe we can have face-to-face meetings at one or both of those events and slowly bring people back together.
Yes.
All right, Endo-san, thank you for making this meeting happen. And thank you so much to our presenters. Thank you, of course, to Russ, Chris, Mary, and Songha for sharing a lot of different types of insights, stories, and case studies. Thank you for our audience. For those of you here in Japan and Korea and China, I wish you a good night. For those of you in Europe, keep working hard. And for those of you in the United States, I hope your day starts well.